read out the title of my
Yes,
talk,
yes,
and
of
that will
course.
be
I am
proper. Then I'll
giving
start.
the title of today's lecture.
Okay, it's
The title of today's lecture is Bimal ke Matilal on linguistic content of cognition and lingophobia in Buddhist epistemology. Please, Professor Bilimoria, sir, you can start now.
well. Thank you. Well, Thakben, I'm very honored to be asked to
Thank you, sir. Thank
give
you
this
for
lecture
accepting.
on. Thank you. Yes, I'm very honored to be asked to present this third memorial lecture in honor of Professor Bimal Matilal, with whom I had very close both academic and personal connections. He is in many respects my guru, and also gave me great support in pursuing Indian and comparative philosophy. So let me start. The vexed issue of the precise connection between words and things or objects has been a major preoccupation over the centuries, summoning the resources of metaphysics, philosophy of language, linguistics, ontology, and increasingly semiological analysis to solve this problem. Indian philosophy produced a number of different and often conflicting solutions, only to be rivaled by the even more bewildering variety of approaches and theories as witnessed in the West, traditional and modern, relying largely on various models of the word, natural, ideal, scriptural, semiotic, etc. So in this paper, I wish to suggest that there is an even more intricate relationship between the model of the word or language and the background view of the world. In other words, it is not at all as simple as sitting down one fine morning and asking, well, old boy, what is the connection between the word and the world? As though it is a question simplicity about some given or givens in our environment. Many theories proceed on the basis of this assumed dualism, if not a complete asymmetry between language and the world, that it is supposed to describe, represent, present, or whatever its function is taken to be in relation to each other. For instance, the strict atomistic or propositional theories of language assumed a transparent distinction between words and the world, such that a correct use of language would successfully represent or picture, that is, mirror, the structure of the world. Language is, quote, grammar of the world, end quote. As Richard Rorty has shown, there has been an obsession with the linguistic end of the analysis. The world is elusively the background or the backdrop to which language has to be reconnected, at least in our understanding and intellectual charting. For common sense tells us that there is a connection, otherwise we would fail to communicate with each other, relate newspaper blotches to events elsewhere, carry on our daily social commerce, fetch a glass of water and ask for one, and take formal promises made by our partners or friends or gurus impeccably seriously, or be sitting here and watching this recording, this lecture. But to ponder whether in some logical or philosophical sense language could precede the world, give us the world, and might even be the condition for the possibility of the world is too often considered to be an evocation of sheer sophistry or merely of mythological significance. Although there are those that did ponder along these lines, Plato with his theory of eidos, Mimamsakas with the doctrine of Purushottama, Bhartrhari, who collapsed the ontology of the world with the higher speech form, Shabda Brahman, and Ludwig Wittgenstein in his more mystical aphorisms about language, continuing a Kantian insight into the a priority of our categories of understanding. But I think there are even more radical critiques and divergent views of language and the world than these few idealistic tendencies might suggest. But we cannot go into all of this here, and I'll come back to this question towards the end. Now, in this context, and with the above as the background, I wish to bring to the forefront the late Bimal K. Matilal's development of Nyaya Visheshika realist approach to the aporia, and occasionally interject the analysis with the dissident Buddhist voice, especially of Chandrakirti. More significantly, it will be the living ghost of Putnam and Damat that I will invoke, as it were, to haunt Matilal's variation on the theme of metaphysical realism. The paper is dedicatory as it is programmatic, and it adds to the continuing review of Matilal's work. Not long back, we had a special issue in Sofia on Bimal Matilal to commemorate his 20 years of passing. The late Professor Bimal Matilal wrote a number of works in which he attempted to get a handle on the problem we have raised. Steeped deeply in classical Indian scholastic philosophy and inspired by analytical currents in Western philosophy, he skillfully analyzed and debated several of the major Oh, I'm sorry, I lost a mixed-up page. Yes, several of the major Indian systems, Nyaya, Buddhism, grammarians, Mimamsa. But his own view was not always clear. It would not be unfair to say that he veered close to a realist ontology or metaphysical realism, as a Christian sits after Donald Davidson, which is evident in his masterful work on perception. And this may have informed or impacted on the formulation of a theory of language appropriate to this ontology. In fact, I want to argue this to be the case, despite his enormous attraction to phenomenalist constructivist theories, especially the Buddhist ones, and his flirtations with Bhartrharian holism, even Saussurean semiology, and later Derridean deconstructionism under the influence of Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak, as he completed his essay on the word and the world. I'm intrigued by all of this, and I wish to trace this line of thinking in Matilal's work, which I believe awaits a fuller response from the Buddhist dialectical critique of language, which Matilal chastises as lingophobia. And it's a term that he's actually used, lingophobia, on the part of Buddhists, you would say, and more on which shortly. Again, it is for this reason that I choose to contrast Matilal on this problematic, as it would seem that at least one insight of Chandrakirti's poses a serious challenge to Matilal's ontological linguistics. That is, I quote, "There is no real connection between the reflected image and the face," end quote. Or for that matter, Dignaga's supposed utterance, language issues from imaginative construction and vice versa, end quote. So I begin with some clues from Matilal's published works and from a succinct paper entitled Some Issues in Nyaya Realism, which I think is not yet published, but parts of it are incorporated in his book on perception. Now, the very first sentence of the chapter in his Navya Nyaya Doctrine of Negation, his seminal first work, begins thus, I quote, "In the West, logic has been primarily concerned with propositions or sentences. Navya Nyaya, like other Indian systems of logic, deals rather with what it calls jnana, by which it means something close to, quote, a particular instance of cognition. An instance of cognition, it is true, can be shown to be ultimately related to some verbal form, namely to a sentence or statement. In the case of determinate or qualificative cognitions, savikalpa, with which Navya Nyaya is chiefly concerned, the relationship is very close. But jnana itself is not a form of language," end quote. This is from page 7 of the Navya Nyaya Doctrine of Negation. Here then is the disavowal. Jnana essentially has nothing to do with sentences or verbal forms. Certain of its qualificative forms might involve verbal delimiters, but its primary connection is with the world of objects, directly and inexorably. So jnana, quote, are always cognitions of or about. And what is denoted by the expressions that fills the blank here is to be taken as the object or objects of such cognitions, end quote. Cognition always refers beyond itself to some object. As such, ascribed a new property, such as jnanatata, according to the Mimamsaka Bhatta's view. The world is as it is, and our cognitions simply bring its very furniture into our sharp conscious focus, no more and no less. There are two other features about jnana that we are urged to note. The object of cognition, at least by the time of Navya Nyaya, has nothing to do with the supposed residue of sensory core, the primitive, unrepresentable, or unstructurable given on a par with sense data, percepts, or uninterrupted sensations. This last bit is a quote from Matilal. Some theories assume or posit this sensory core either to give legitimate support to an objective characterization of particulars in experience, or simply to force an argument towards an other subjective, conceptual, or indeed imaginative construction of a particular, conceding that there is no way of establishing any causal connection between this internal core of experience and what appears as the external object of awareness. Now, Matilal attributes the latter motivation to Dignaga and makes the curious following observation, and I shall quote this long passage since it is intriguing. These self-characterized objects, he writes, which are similar to sense data or percepts, and which some philosophers in modern West have described in language by such verbless complex, read here now, are unanimously regarded by Dignaga and other Indian philosophers, count Chandakirti in here, as virtually and actually ineffable. This obviously depended upon a view of language. Language depends upon shared properties, which are results of the synthesizing aspects of mental construction. For language is a social affair, as Quine had once said. The private sensory core, which are unique particulars, cannot therefore be expressed in language. This is also reminiscent of the argument against the notion of private language a la Wittgenstein in modern times. And I was saying that this obviously depended upon a view of language. What is the referent of this here? The claim that there is an ineffable core of sensory private experience, or its attempted description? I think he intends the former, ineffable core of sensory private experience. But if so, why is this metaphysical thesis about the unavailability of language made dependent upon the prevailing view of language? Isn't this a claim that stands on its own right, on a par with other similar logical and epistemological claims? So I detect a slight bias here. And of course, the remark about language being a social affair, which Wittgenstein presumably also underscored in his denial of private language, for very different reasons though, is, I'm afraid to say, not much developed here or elsewhere in Matilal's work. Nevertheless, we get a second clue a few lines down when we turn to the Nyaya view proper. Nyaya apparently disputed the relevance of this residual sensory core, as this is neither error, nor jnana, nor even foundation for knowledge. Again, I quote, later on in the same realist tradition, even its cognitive role was called into question, for there was a prevalent theory of language ascribed to Bhartrhari, which maintained that language and thought, any cognitive experiences, are inextricably intertwined such that language anchors thought and vice versa. Being influenced by this theory, the Nyaya realists claim that any cognitive experience must be expressible in language. The ineffable sensory core, if there is any, should be little more than physiological surface irritation, and hence non-cognitive. Besides, by its very nature, it would not be even introspectable or amenable to inner perception. Introspectable states have a judgmental structure. End quote. This is from the paper that I referred to. All right. So we're back. So cognitions once again. Although a more detailed concern with attributed predicate property is prior knowledge, corporal relations with universals, for example, cowhood in the judgment, X is those which need not detain us here presently. What Matilal wants to stress is that Nyaya categorically denies the role in any significant epistemological data. It is found to be almost superfluous, as structured thoughts or judgments are not, therefore, interpretations or organizations of these raw data, for we have no conscious verbal access to such data. Now, what is being said? It seems to me the following. The raw sensory core might well be there. We do not know, as we have no linguistic access to it. It's perhaps only a surface physiological irritation, to quote him, or physiogenic motions like feelings and other sensations. Language only comes into play or into foreground when judgments are being formed or about to be formed. This is structured perception, and language should be banished from having concerns with the pre-linguistic, uninterrupted, unstructured, or pre-structured data. We should pause to note, while Nyaya theory of cognition admits an indeterminate phase, namely nirvikalpa, prior to the arising of the determinate judgment, which is savikalpa, the pre-linguistic, pre-structured inchoate state which Matilal is denying is not to be identified with Nirvikalpa phase. For the Nirvikalpa Jnana already is on its way to being structured, or one might say that it registered the logical precondition for the determinate Jnana. The difference is in degree rather than kind, as Matilal once put it to me. Some contemporary scholars, however, like my Guru Bhai Arindam Chakrabarti, have gone further and urged that the whole bang caboodle of Nirvikalpa Jnana should be jettisoned from the discourse of the content of cognition. There is no such moment in the episodic birth of state. So there's a lot going on in here. So on this strong point of the rejection of the so-called or supposed ineffable base, which Matilal attributes to Gangesha, he adverts to Donald Davidson's explosion of the myth of the core, an inexplicable given, which otherwise leads to a kind of conceptual relativism. So he avers, quote, I find a support to Davidson's conclusion in Gangesha's clever move to direct our attention to the logical prerequisites of a propositional knowledge or judgment and omit our talk of the unstructured data or the pure pre-linguistic content of our conceptual experience, end quote. At core, what Matilal actually wants to endorse is a version of metaphysical or external realism, sometimes he calls it direct realism, that comes through as an implication of Davidson's doctrine and which he believes is upheld by the Nyaya-Vaisheshika philosophers who are apparently in a head-on collision course with the idealist and relativist in India. It is significant, he notes, quote, that they mistrust in the availability of the pure, structureless data as well as their outright rejection of any form of representation of intentional content or propositional entities intervening between us and the world seems not only compatible with, but also conducive to their brand of realism, if we can omit some minor details, end quote. This is a telling endorsement, even as it underscores a motivation on Matilal's part. We must at all costs reject so-called idealist and relativist versions of the theory, which rely precisely on language's interventionist role, and pander to paradigms of representation or of intentionality and so on. So before I say anything more on the preferred paradigm or context, let me refer to a thought experiment. The distinction between schema is alluded to in this realist critique. This comes from Hilary Putman, and it is highly instructive as it has been provocative, though I'll modify it a bit. And their propositional knowledge attached to this objective characterization, there is no gainsaying that it is exactly what is intended by the use of the term H2O on Earth A and vice versa. In other words, both make judgments that look on the face of it to be identical, but there is no way in which we can say that each side shares the knowledge and therefore linguistic contents involved in exactly identical terms. It so happens that their conventions of common sense discourse coincide, but this gives no warrant to suppose that they are perceiving and are therefore speaking about the same reality, queer reality. Of course, Putnam uses this imaginary example to bolster his own theory of internal, or what he calls common sense realism, which stops external or metaphysical realism on its tracks. So now I'm coming to my main argument. The central point to be made is not that, or not simply that, on the one hand, there are no ineffable unstructured percepts. On the other hand, that language anchors thought, or that all our cognitions are shot through with language. But to acknowledge that language anchors, or might just well spread over and encompass, the unstructured, pre-structured content of our experience as well. I think Mark Sideritz has made this plea more forcefully in his book on Indian philosophy of language. To put it more cynically, why privilege languages anchor only in respect of cognitive or structured experiences and deny trekking all the way down to the sensory core, or to other kinds of sensations, or even to connotative states such as emotions? This latter denial, when forced, leads ultimately to the denial of the pre-structured core as well, which is an ontological claim and not therefore the business of epistemological or linguistic analysis, a fault too readily committed by the Nyayikas, despite cautionary reminders from the Buddhist quarters. Now, returning to the question of the preferred paradigm, I would suggest a reason for why I think realists in India opted for this rather more simple-minded characterization of the role of language in relation to our awareness of things. And here I turn to the Nyaya theory of perception, which again Matilal has best articulated for us. In the Nyaya theory, not other theories of perception. Details aside, we know that the theory moved from Gautama's rather cruder version of sense organ contact with object, the India Sanikarsha view, to Gangesha's more elegant view of the directness of the presentation of the object to awareness. Neither any sort of contact nor first-person ascertainment is deemed necessary. The mind directly touches the object. A Lockean type of representationalism, Berkeleyan idealism, Humean sense data empiricism, Brentonian or Husserlian intentional content phenomenologism are all set aside, and would have no bar with any kind of phenomenalism, constructivism, or constructionalism. And F attribute all that one is in the initial grasping, that is in the nirvikalpa phase, which is absolutely unmediated and gets promptly completed when the F attribute, which may be a simple universal on an unanalyzable property, as the qualifier is conjoined with the qualificandum X, the nebulous haze that floats into awareness, whence immediately arises the cognition G equals Fx. The relation that causally connects F and X as A relation B, ARP, are also said to be real and touched in awareness. Such a theory of perception indeed is also most conducive to the doctrine of realism being harnessed, albeit direct or metaphysical realism. Now, for those of this doctrine, nothing should be allowed or supposed to stand in the way of directness of the perceptual grasp, the touching of reality, language that is words and concepts included. In other words, F attribute neither presupposes a cognition of a thing of which it is a cognition, which is the preserve of vaguely floating X is X or this, nor does the X presuppose a sensory core data to which it ascribes the attributes of features. For all such presuppositions would either lead to a paradox or be prolix and therefore unwarranted. So to be sure, the F attributes are linguistic in a sense or linguistically imbued, for otherwise it would make no sense to speak of universals such as cowness, color sensations such as red patches, or other properties such as blobs of coldness or very hotting and so on as featuring in the awareness. Qualifiers are proper instantiations in predicate form, and as such their function is one of characterization. This admission, which Nyayikas have no difficulty in making, is probably with Matilal counts as the modified adoption of the Bhartaharian thesis, according to which these sensations that penetrate the linguistic level, not that the linguistic tropes penetrate the sensory level, and as the Buddhists might have it. But the primacy of the process, we should note, is never given to the linguistic. It is given rather to the cognitive. Recall Matilal's opening sentence earlier, and only secondarily to the linguistic. Hence, the allusion to the Bhartaharian influence is a bit of a red herring or a misnomer, for Nyayikas are no metaphysical Bhashavadins, proper names that occur without calling of the mother of necessity. Still, the assertion about all thought or judgment being explicable in words is indeed, in the Nyaya view, so as to people should turn off their mics rather, because it's interfering. Their view is to, quote, avoid the reduction of the public concept finally to the inexpressible phenomenal criteria. They are identified in terms of causal relations between agents in the world, there being nothing in between on this, end quote. But how much of the linguistic criteria has the Nyaya allowed to penetrate the cognitive process? This question is pertinent, for what is grasped or perceived is not a bit of language, but an object, which is descriptively marked as possessing such and such a feature. So let me summarize and analyze the argument thus far. The Nyaya position is, as Matilal has it, that sensations have no co-unstructured component. All cognitions worth their hara salt arises structured. Linguistic elements attach themselves like yokes, not plows, to the farming oxen, and their causal connections with the things of which their cognitions is indubitably direct. This approach guarantees the conclusions of metaphysical realism, or perhaps metaphysical, that is external realism, dictates just such a linguistically compromised doctrine of knowing. Matilal says as much, thus, quote, all this, the Nyayikas assert, were needed to remain true to their view of metaphysical realism. That's all this, end quote. But whether they are necessary is, of course, another and indeed the moot question. But this remains to be shown, though I believe Sivajivan Bhattacharya and Stephen Phillips in their works on Gangesha have been making good progress on this very issue. So let me state this realist position. The Nyaya philosophers committed to metaphysical realism assert that we in fact see the objects we take ourselves to see, as opposed to properties, surfaces, sensations, cause sense data, and so on. The Nyaya philosophers also argued that those exist by having parts without being merely the sum of their parts, that they fall into the objective natural categories. They argued that the parts and properties of an object may well feature in the explanation of our coming to see it, but the thesis denies that the parts or properties of the object can enter into the explanation only if they themselves become entities of perceptual awareness. If this is correct, Matilal points out, then the move typically made by Buddhist phenomenalists that the percept, the alambana, in perceptual awareness must be unstructured and immediately given is blocked. This leads to what Matilal is the hardest problem for the Nyaya realist. If phenomenal entities like sense data have no explanatory role in perception, how do we account for such apparently pure phenomenal illusions as seeing the blue dome of the sky, a rainbow, or a circular disk as elliptical? Matilal's defense of this theory is anchored on the unique formulation of objectivity. To be objective, he argued, is to be independent of minds. Being mind-dependent, however, need not mean being private, intentional object in the way that sense data or other purely phenomenal entities are. It can mean simply having a mental event as a causal condition, an event on whose continuing existence the object depends. Although illusory, the blueness of the sky and the ellipticality of the disk are objective, at least in the sense that they are not purely private objects of sensation, but are produced and shared by perception of any observer located in the appropriate position. This is a softer realism than that to which skeptics are committed, according to which objects can exist independently of anyone's capacity to know they exist. Matilal was a rare kind of a thinker, a philosopher of profound sensibility, who embodied East and West in balanced proportion and who demonstrated that Indian thought, even in its most metaphysical and soteriological concept, was rigorously analytical and logical, as well as discursive. Coming to the final part. Now, as to language per se or shabda, which as a whole is, which as a whole is another pramana, since we obtain knowledge from using linguistic utterances, it too must operate in more or less the same way and conform to the same criteria or conditions of external causal connectivity. Otherwise, the knowledge it delivers us will be much compromised and contaminated, not least by its own excesses. Worse still, if especially the Tower of Babel and Babylus is admitted into the fray, we risk conceptual relativism. But most of all, if we are to remain committed to true brood, that is anticipating Davidson and Dummett metaphysical realism, then we must find a way of talking about language that sustains this doctrine optimally. How can we achieve that? Well, there is one simple route, namely, use the model of sensory perception as a paradigm for linguistic knowledge, with all the devices, critical requirements, and descriptive categories open up for us in the theory of propositional knowledge discussed thus far. Seek to ground this doctrine of word and knowledge in the direct grasp modality that Gangesha has insisted upon for sensory perception. Do not allow concepts, vikalpa, thrown up randomly or unconsciously by the mind through karmic traces or love's desire or private reflective tropes or other discursive items outside of the shared public language to interfere with and mediate the otherwise immaculate continuum between the word and the world. This is not unlike the Kantian stricture on the categories of understanding, which were to be strictly rational, that is, universal in form, and were not to be mixed up with relative projections, artifacts of imagination, human intentionalities, inclinations, and so forth. Language, despite the temptations coming from the likes of Chandrakirti, and more recently echoed in post-Husserlian semiological movements led by Ronald Barthes in France and Derrida more famously in North America, is not to be regarded as a self-contained system of science which make reference only to internally bifurcated or constructed signifiers, or that it is only by wild stretch of imagination that any real term reference of what Frege called Bedeutung is achieved. If the latter were the case, we would not be able to distinguish between true and false sentences. The F attributes must and do necessarily feature in the object of which it is a verbally derived cognition for linguistic judgments that are true. That is how we know from words. It is then little wonder that Arinam Chakravarti, following the same tradition, would question whether it is even possible for someone to understand a patently false sentence such as odorless green cheese utters Martian music. For one would be hard-pressed to make a logically coherent connection of fx to g. This predilection for a realist thesis of language in the epistemic moves undergirding it is further borne out in K.C. Bhattacharya's wonderful description of how Shabda functions in the context of a karana. The word, he says, reaches out to the thing. It touches the thing. Now, Professor Mohanty and I have commented in some detail on K.C. Bhattacharya's immensely helpful insight. But again, here, I wish to point out to the unargued but presupposed bias towards the realist schema which informs this insight. And direct realism can only produce. Bhattacharya may well have believed that the world is linguistically given to us, but the world as a whole, but only the public space, one half of the cognitive act, and that to the predicate side is linguistically riven. All else, thankfully, is free from the ravages and relativistic tendencies of a more general course of linguistics. Philosophy. Why not, however, go all the way and take seriously the Buddhist dialectical argument that even this partial linguisticality, as considered in the Nyaya cognitive theory, is an imaginative construction, that indeed language is a figment of our inclination, desires, intentionalities, which cover up the absence of real causal connections. In other words, we're far from convincingly established a necessary causality in respect of the X and the F attributes which float into and feature respectively, in our awareness as prakrata or as visheshana. Or alternatively, consider that as a shared public or collective discourse, language is not devoid of its own relativities, constructions, self-referentialities, community or tradition transmitted intentionalities, and so on, that get in the way of authentic grasping of the world, which can only be wordless. Right, good. So, thank you. That's the end of my paper. I'd be happy to take some questions. So, maybe to summarize, because it's been technical. So, what Matilal was trying to say is that, we have direct experience of object. There's a causal relation between the two. There are no sense data or some ineffable core in our perception, because language is already embedded in the structure of the way in which we perceive those objects. So we don't actually, we don't have some kind of, we do have some X floating in, but that's not really part of the epistemological or the epistemic experience at all. What William James had called, buzzing, fuzzing, ephemeral things that happen, like when we wake up from a dream. Everything is a bit fuzzy. That's not really the point here at all, as far as the direct realist theory is concerned. But what's interesting is that why it's direct realism is that we want to stress not the F attributes, but the GX. So it's as though sort of language already works through our cognitive experience, and I wouldn't say manufactures, but presents the object as a fully formed object, as a whole, and then so it's not the red that we see, but the tomato-ness that we see, and then we sort of attribute parts to it. Or rather, we might even say that it's sort of a red patch, and then we attribute the property of tomato to it. That might be the more correct characterization of Professor Bimal Matilal's ideas here. But notice that the redness is already a universal. It's not some fuzzy, imaginative, in the Buddhist sense, conceptual, rudderless, objectless experience. It's already an objective experience as far as Bimal Matilal is concerned. Okay, so that's really in a nutshell what the theory is, and of course he finds support for that in Donald Davidson's sort of conceptual, concept schema ideas and so on. Although I might say that the language that's used as far as Bimalda is concerned, it's not a language sort of context dependent or not sort of private. It is somehow sort of conceived to be very descriptive, rather more than descriptive, explanatory language involved. So there's no anthropology concept you're allowed to bring into this, or phenomenology for that matter. It's taken me quite some time to try and sort of really get to understand this position, which is articulated very, very clearly in the work on perception for sure, and more recently in the work that people are doing on Gangesha. So I think I'll leave it at that and perhaps take some questions or comments or response if you like. Thank you. So is the moderator going to come in now? There seems to be a bit of a silence going on.
Hello, Purvan. Hello, Purvan. Sir. Hello, yes. Sir.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just a clarification. Yeah. What is the status of sensory code in Neo system, as they have regarded sensory code neither knowledge nor error, and it is not expressible in language also. So what is the status of the sensory code in Neo system?
Well, I mean, that's the big question in the debate here. I mean, the claim, and I'm really more. There are various different views in Nyaya on this. They can be, but I'm taking more the interpretation that Professor Matilal offers. And I think that you want to say that if by sensory core you mean some ineffable sort of raw data in the way in which sense data was talked about by early empiricists and so on, or perhaps in psychology also, if say that's aligned with what the Buddhists might call nirvikalpa, it virtually does not exist. It's not there, right? There is a talk of, well, X modes into my awareness, right? And then my awareness then sets about structuring it. But that's as explained to me, that's sort of in hindsight, we might say that. But the time, there isn't a sort of a time. We in our analysis are trying to inject kind of a time sequence, a time sequence in that. But there is no time sequence of that kind, right? So practically speaking, what we're doing is we're taking the X part as the sensory core, right? When in fact X is not the sensory core, but X reveals itself when we attach the F attributes onto that, right? Onto that. So the X attributes sort of open it up. So to give that example that I gave about the tomato nuts, you have the redness, right? So the redness come about, right? The redness comes about. That already is X. And then we put the F attribute. Tomato has a branch on it, and so on. Okay? So, in a sense, there is no sensory core. That's what direct realism is. Somebody's mic is on. They could turn it off. Mic off, please. Yeah. So that is what the main. Let me read out that part. Let me read out that part again. That was a little got lost in sort of technicality somewhere. That it's sort of imbued. It's imbued through and through with language. Okay, whereas is really a wrong way of looking at the theory altogether. We need to get rid of the whole talk of sensory core. We need to set aside, as I said, the argument is that the sensory core, which people have kind of identified with the nirvikalpa and so on, needs to be called into question. Needs to be called into question altogether, right? So there is an intertwining of language and our cognitive process. There is no separation. It's out. So it's along those lines. So the primary connection, here we are. So that was on. Here we are. In the West, logic has primarily concerned with propositional sentences. Nyaya, like other systems of logic, deals rather with what it calls jnana, by which it means something close to particular instances of cognition. Now, an instance of cognition, it is true, can be shown to be ultimately related to some verbal form, namely to a statement of sentences. In the case of determinate or qualified cognition, savikalpa or vishishta jnana, with which Navya Nyaya is chiefly concerned, the relationship is very close. But jnana itself is not a form of language. Here then is a disavowal. Language, jnana essentially has nothing to do with sentence or verbal forms. Certain of its qualificative forms involve verbal delimiters, right? But its primary connection is with the world of objects, directly or inexorably. So jnanas are always cognitions of or about what is denoted by the expressions that fills the blank here is taken to be as objects of such cognitions. So our cognition do not have some sensory core that people keep talking about. It's directly related to the object. There's a causal relation with the object, and what we are seeing, is an objective mind-independent reality, right? But if you bring in sensory core, then you have to bring in all kinds of interpretive mechanisms and say, well, my mind is interpreting. I'm projecting concepts on it, which is the Buddhist view. So that's what gets into problems. Somebody just asked a question about what is the Buddhist explanation of nirvikalpa knowledge. Well, in Buddhist, it's not knowledge at all. It's not jnana in any sense at all. It's just some part of an experience which is a given, which is ineffable, which might run all over the place. It would be a little like when you're seeing a mirage on a street, and you immediately think it is water, but in fact, your experience of it is not water. Your experience of it is some shiny thing happening on the street, and you make a projection of water, and that leads to an error, but you're not aware of that error. Whereas the Nyaya theory wants to say that you actually have a direct connection, a causal connection with the object, and that construction happens almost immediately without presupposing a pre-linguistic core to it. Does that make sense?
Thank you, sir. Yes.
Okay. Maybe we could take some questions that people are asking.
Yes, sir. A couple of questions in the chat box. Specifically, I want to read one by one question, sir. Am I audible, sir?
Yes.
Yeah, Professor Santosh Kumar Pal from Bardhaman Department of Philosophy. He asked a question, a bit of explanation of the word lingophobia used. Actually, he want to know what is the exact intention of lingophobia.
Okay, the better explanation. Okay, now this is so when I was sitting through seminars with Professor Matilal, he used the term, and I thought, what is this term? And of course it also appears in his published work as well, and I give a reference with page 6 of the of perception. So lingo, I might be wrong, but it could be the Navya Nyaya theory of negation, but I think it's in perception, or it could be the paper that I referred to, but I have to go back and look again. So what he means is that it would seem sort of somewhat contradictory, because the Buddhists are the ones who say that we project concepts, we project linguistic bits and pieces, linguistic tropes onto things that we take to be experiential content. But that's only in a phenomenalist. That's only in a phenomenalist context. So what is the basically saying, especially in Yogacara, if you take some of Yogacara very seriously, is that you have this experience and you put some concept onto it, and you say, I'm experiencing apple, but it could be a complete construction. Okay, that's not the kind of language that's being talked about in the Nyaya context. It's more or less like the sort of categories of understanding in the way that Immanuel Kant was using, right? So they're not just vague projections. Space is not just a projection, a subjective projection. It has organized. It's part of our category of understanding. So sort of that Buddhists are lingophobia, meaning that they're afraid of that kind of language, not which is objective language, not the language of private, the sort of Wittgensteinian idea of private language and so forth. So he wants to say language plays the kind of role that people would also say logic plays of the world. So there's a correlation between logic and language that logic doesn't help us. Logic doesn't do any old construction of the world. I mean, necessity, for example, if we use our certain logical moves and so forth, we make those connections. Not subjectively, but those connections are as it were given in the world. So that's what he is trying to say, that we as Nyayakas have an ontological.
Nurul Islam, please stop your presenting. Nurul Islam, please stop your presenting. Nurul Islam. Gour Islam, stop your presenting.
So can I just finish this?
Yeah.
Let me.
Sorry. Continue.
So language is to be understood in a more precise ontological sense, right? It is not language in a sort of subjectivist, constructive sense in which the Buddhists are using. That's what he meant by lingophobia, right? That's what he meant by lingophobia, which surprised me because I thought the Buddhists were the ones who ran with the theory that the whole world that we're seeing and so forth are just series of constructions of our vikalpas or from past traces and so on, and it gets even more and more idealistic as you go into Yogacara. Now this is an attack, of course, in the West as well on the idealist theories of language, where people say everything is ideas, but everything is ideas, and those ideas are sort of bits of language that have fallen out, but there's no particular place from which they fell out. Critical theory people would come in and say that these are also really all cultural constructs that are built up, which postmodernists will argue. But the attempt here is to sort of rescue language from that kind of constructivist, nominalist preoccupations to a more objective, ontological, which is why we call it metaphysical realism, but it's not metaphysical in the speculative sense of metaphysical. It's a much more intricate connection of language and the world. So, Bimal Das, one of his last words was the word and the world. It's not that the word is connecting to the world as a figment of the mind. It's not a figment. The word is not a figment of the mind. The word is a real part, if you like, of the world. I mean, I'm not quite sure how else to understand it, but to say that. Okay, I think I answered that question. If there's somebody else wanted to come in.
Very nice, sir. So, another question from our research scholar, Abhijit Vishwas. You want to know, can sub-vocal speech be a logical language?
I don't understand. I know what is subvocal.
Sub-vocal speech. Abhijit Vishwas is there. Yeah, Abhijit?
Yes, sir, yes.
Yeah, you ask your question.
What
You unmute your phone and ask question.
Actually, subvocal means, sir, pain. Actually, subvocal means, sir, pain.
Pain.
Yes, sir.
Pain.
P-I-N, pen.
Pain, arki, betha.
Okay. Regarding actually he's asking the question of private language, sir, in connection with private language.
I don't think. Yes, I guess so. I guess you could say that. Yeah, there could be lingophobia. No, I did. I made that connection. I said, they are part of the private language discourse that could lead to not lingophobia. Yeah, well, it could lead to. I mean, it's a different kind of language that we're talking.
And one of our colleague he's known as Niramkush Chakrabarti, assistant professor at Gajal College, is asking question: what is nature of perception in Adhyasam? As the rope as a snake.
Yeah, I think it's the example that I gave of the blue in the sky, or the sky flower, or the rainbow. I think they would say that there are two real perceptions that are happening. There's the rope, but also the snake, which we had a real experience of at another time, or in a museum or in a zoo rather, if we've never seen a snake real, and that's a real one, and this is a real one. It's a big trail. It's Adhyasa. I mean, I think that's more perhaps a bit of a downturn, and the relating of the illusion is in relating the two real, misrelating, the disjunction of the two real perceptions in one cognition. That's the problem. The problem is not the way that the Vedantists try to explain that the whole is an error. No, the whole perception is not an error. Seeing the blue in the sky is not an illusion. It is the blue that we're seeing, and it is the open space, and the two things are being put together, or the sky flower, the sky which we're seeing, and the flower, the two things are put together. Jay Shaw describes this very, very, very well in some of his work. Jay Shankar Shaw. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Then there is no question in the chat box. If I'm inviting question from our student friends, students, if you are interested, you may ask question. Professor
Question from Anantagiri.
Anantagiri.
Limits of objectivism and the ontological dimensions of cognition and epistemology.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, the ontological dimensions of cognition is what this is really about. This is talking about the ontological dimensions of cognition must involve language as well. That's what the argument here is. And so the whole thing comes into a description of epistemology. It's epistemology of metaphysical realism here is what's being described. But the limits of objectivism, this is probably a different question. I think the limits of objectivity would be what would be, yes. So you have in the Pramana case, you can have in the Pramana of perception, there are various defeaters, there are various defects that can come in. Those are the things that would cause the limitations. But other than that, the world is as it is given to us. I don't think that the limitations are unnecessary limitations of objectivism. They're limitations of the conditions under which objective experiences happen. Because some people will of course say that, and later Putnam, from that example that the experiment that we talked about, the Twin Earth experiment, he became more and more skeptical about the complete independence of the world from the mind, right? So he would say that the world and mind is the world. The mind and the world is the world and the mind. So the two things are intertwined in very close proximity. Now I don't think Bimal would disagree with that. But what he would say is that, and I think I read out that part, that objectivism for him, or rather, perhaps I should use objectivity for him, does not necessarily mean that the objects have to be totally independent of the mind. The mind does intervene, and it intervenes through a causal connection which creates for an intimacy between the object and the world, right? So, in a sense, we're not committing completely to the old style, positivist style of objectivism. There is a role that the mind plays. The role that the mind plays is via language. That's to be kept in mind, right? It's not by discerning or unearthing sensory cores and sense data and so forth. What the mind does is it provides the wherewithal, the backdrop, as it were, of language on which representation is made. See, you might as well even say, I mean, I've even thought about it, and I talked with a lot of people who worked on Bimal's work. It's almost as though he's saying, language is the screen on which the world is received. And that's what cognition is, that's what jnana is, right? But it's not subjective, because the cognition is not happening inside, the cognition is actually happening outside. So you're actually perceiving things outside. It's not the sense data not the sense data view where the senses go out. It's more through the extended mind. The mind, in a way, goes out. I've written a paper on the extended mind, and I've actually used this as an example because the mind is, in a sense, vigu. I mean, I'm not quite sure how to understand that, but I think what it might mean is that it's the Cartesian fallacy, the dualism, that the mind is somehow locked in our nervous system, now in our brain, and that it does not travel out, but the senses travel out. Whereas I think in the Indian view, the mind, and I may be bringing in too much Advaita theory of Chit here, but I think in symbolically, let us say as a metaphor, not literally, the mind has an extended existence whereby the objects participate in the mind and present themselves to the mind. The mind does not have to be locked inside the brain, so it's not operating through percepts, it's not receiving percepts, sense data, intentionality in the Husserlian sense of noema, noesis, so it's all noetic data you're working on. You don't need all of that. Just suppose if the mind can be out here on the computer, I'm seeing the computer where the computer is located. I'm not seeing it in my head. So in other words, somehow the language would I don't know if it provides space as well, but we have to account for the spatial dimension too. How come it's far away from people at this distance, and that thing is that distance, and the stars which or exploded 2 million years ago are still being seen at that distance. Those are things that we need to work out. They haven't really been worked out, but at least the gesture towards this objective position here, with certain limitations, of course. I mean, the space is one of the ones, time is another one. I mean, these things have not been factored in any of these theories here. In perception, in the way that they ought to be. Okay, so I think we answered that question.
Okay, sir. Now I'm asking Professor Monil Chanel.
Nirvikalpa is Abhyapadesha, and the object in that state is not fully developed. I'm assuming Nirvikalpa is not a mere positive, but this is a separate. No, see, this is the whole. We're taking. That's more the early part. And you read. This is pretty well known contemporary literature. The Abhyapadesha, the discussion of Nirvikalpa, Pratyaksha, Nirvikalpa Jnana, I'm not quite sure that is Nirvikalpa Pratyaksha as such, is really being set aside. We bracket that out altogether. That's really what's being set aside because it's getting in the way of direct realism. If you're going to have a theory of direct realism, you need to trim back all the Nirvikalpa discussions altogether and go straight to Savikalpa. Or forget about the distinction between Nirvikalpa and Savikalpa and use some other language, the language of being fully formed. That's what we mean by. So when you get an object, it's already fully formed, and I'm using my words, these are Bimal's words. It comes already complete, if you like. The object is already complete. So if everybody knows my face mug, my flowers, my praise flowers, they are, when I see them, they are fully formed. It's surprising. In some ways, I'm not seeing the part, right? My eyes are not actually seeing the back part, or nor is it seeing the ear, but somehow my cognition let me trust that there is a bottom, there is a back part, and there is something inside it, by the way. Because people create illusions and so they put mirrors and make you feel that it's a full cup when it's not. But those are exaggerated positions or aberrations. What we're seeing are already fully formed, right? If say, I wasn't looking at it and this blue thing comes my way, I'd say a blue thing floated in my consciousness, right? But that people have taken that to be the Nirvikalpa state. But what being said here is that that's not Nirvikalpa. There is no Nirvikalpa. It's already fully formed. Okay, if that makes sense, right? So it does not exist as a separate state of affairs in the process of cognition. No, it's being taken out because, and I think the motivation is coming from. It's been attributed to Gangesha, but I think the motivation is also coming from Western philosophers, right? Who want to get rid of the old psychologism. This is that leads to a kind of psychologism. You might have to then deal with all of the psychological causes of objects. But and of course people will say yes, but people see pink elephants, if they're drunk, or people hallucinate and so on and so forth. But those are not regular or normal state option. We first talk about terrain, and then we can talk about things that are aberrations from there. So that's really what is being argued in this position, that there is no construction being involved. But if you admit nirvikalpa, then constructionism sneaks in. So the way to get rid of constructionism is to get rid of nirvikalpa altogether. Does that make in the review of the limits of the language. But I don't think that transplanted in the theory that that Bimal Matilal is developing here. I don't think he would say that the limits of our world is supervenient on the limits of our language. If anything, our language helps the world flourish, helps us understand and make an inroad into the world. It's more, language is the tool by which we access the world. Otherwise, we don't know what the world would be. So instead of thinking in terms of limits, you think in terms of frontiers and horizons opening up. See what I mean? And the more you understand the relation between language and the world, and the better you refine the language, the more access you have. And yeah, I think it's a bit like mathematics. If you develop mathematics, then you can use mathematics more and more in your observation statements. You open up the observation statements, and measurement in the cosmos opens up to you. I mean, Einstein certainly had used a certain development in mathematics to be able to come up with some of the theories and things that they came up with. So, I think mathematics would be a more of a model here. Certainly, yeah. I mean, the progress of science has gone hand in hand with the progress of mathematics. So I think that the Wittgensteinian sort of the Wittgenstein saying that private language. But of course, people will say, well, if it's just a substance, a dravya, not a spiritual substance, but a sort of a physical substance, then you get into the sort of naturalist fallacy, and it can't go out. it would make sense to talk about mind going out. But then, we do talk about senses going out, right? We do have the five senses and so on. They go out, they come back, so on. When music comes on, my ears are listening to the music there. A smell of agarbatti happens, and my nose, as it were, goes out there, and so on. So, if the mind is a sixth sense, why can't it go out? That's a question that I want to ask. Why can't we talk about the mind going out? And in that sense, if all the indriyas are vibhu, then manas is also vibhu. That is how I'm trying to understand what's going on here. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Just few more minutes. Professor Jhareshwar Ghosh will offer the vote of thanks. Thank you once again.
Pleasure. I must find my...
Professor Jhareshwar Ghosh, please, Jhareshwar Da, offer your vote of thanks. Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, am I audible, Purban?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
You're audible to me, yeah.
Good afternoon to ourselves and evening to Professor Bilimoria. We are now at the
my first name. I like to hear my first name rather than Bilimoria, some ancestral Parsi, Gujarati, throwback. But anyway, I thought I would be part of the tradition. Wouldn't I be part of the darshanis if I were called Purushottama?
Yeah, Purushottama. So, yeah, we are now at the last phase of the third Bimal Krishna Matilal Memorial Lecture. I feel very much honored and lucky to have the opportunity to give a vote of thanks on the historical and philosophical occasion for the Department of Philosophy, University of Gour, Banga. Time and tide wait for none. It is historical because this event is now imprinted in the golden letters of the history of this department.
I see.
The aim of the memorial lecture is to serve as a focus on Professor Bimal Krishna Motilal's contribution in the area of philosophy. Professor Bimal Krishna Motilal was an important Indian philosopher and Indologist who introduced many Western thinkers to Indian philosophical thought by demonstrating the common concern of the two traditions. His work was wide-ranging, covering not just Nyaya Vaisheshik, but Mimamsa, Buddhist and Jaina philosophy, ethics and the philosophy of language. The unifying motto of Professor Bimal Krishna Motilal's work is the study of rational traditions in Indian philosophical thought. With his ability to span the divide between Indian and Western intellectual tradition, he brought contemporary techniques of analytical philosophy to bear upon the issues raised in classical Indian philosophy and conversely to highlight the relevance of Indian thought in modern world. We are very much fortunate enough because today with us Professor Matilal's Uttaradayada, Professor Purushottama Bilimoria. Sir, you delivered a lucid and thought-provoking lecture on Bimal Krishna Motilal on linguistic content of cognition and lingophobia in Buddhist epistemology. We feel proud for Professor Purushottama sir, you have published a lot of things like Shabda Pramana, word and knowledge, testimony in Indian philosophy, post-colonial philosophy of religion, Indian ethics, classical and contemporary challenges, and most recently, Routledge's history of Indian philosophy give us a very enlightened us and comparative studies and Hinduism, sustainability, interdisciplinary and interreligious inquiry, and Hegel's reading of the logic of Indian philosophy, Australasian philosophical review. You are working and writing on the area of Western analytical, continental and Indian philosophy of religion, ethics, post-colonial studies, personal law, Indian liberalism and diaspora studies covering Australasia. So that is why I am saying you are the true sense of Uttarodaya of Professor Bimal Krishna Matilal sir. Sir, in your discussion, you mentioned Matilal's realistic theory of language within the Navya and Navya tradition, Naya and Navya tradition. The issue of language mainly arises while dealing with the content of Jnana. You are rightly point out, sir. Dinak and many other Indian philosophers, including Chandrakirti, arrived at this view of cognition due to their supposition that private language is possible. But in your discussion, you rightly mentioned your guru's contribution that Matilal refutes this view by using the argument, especially of Wittgenstein, that language is a social behavior. Language is a social art. Thus, Matilal turns into a lingophobia that reduces mental entities to mere mystical things or false imaginations. Matilal interprets this to be a version of metaphysical realism, which argues for an inseparable connection between language and cognition. The way in which Professor Bilimoria sir explained, Professor Purushottama Bilimoria sir explained this subject it is extraordinary. Thank you for your very interesting discussion. I am sure that all the participants have taken your critical analysis. I would like to thank you again for making this event a grand success. Namaskar, sir.
Namaskar.
I would like I would like to convey my regards to our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Chanchal Chaudhary, for his inspiration, motivation, and his kind approval by which we can organize this memorial lecture and our registered dean, finance officer for their strong sense of love and affection. I must not forget to thank our beloved coordinator, Department of Philosophy, University of Gour, Banga, Dr. Purbayan Jha. Purbayan is the real architect of the very successful Professor Bimal Krishna Motilal's memorial lecture. Every time he is thinking for the betterment of the academic program of the department. I convey my heartfelt thanks to Purbain and wishing you your tireless, innovative journey for a better tomorrow.
So if I were in West Bengal, I would be given a shawl.
Sure, sir. If you after this Corona situation, please visit us. It would be wonderful to have you physically.
I miss this ceremony of being given.
Yes.
Usually from Shanti Niketan. That's what I. So
I believe you would. We believe you would like our place also, and if you visit someday.
No, someday I will. I would like to visit for sure.
Yes, and thank you so much for being so patient in answering the questions, observations. It's been.
It shows the love I had for my for my Guruji. Yeah.
Yes. That's right.
I mean, I can be critical. I'm critical and don't take everything. But
that's why I mentioned you are critically discuss all these things, sir. Yeah. I also convey.
Has been given in a true sense. Yes. Please. Yes.
I also convey my gratitude and thanks to Professor Joshna Shah, Dr. Shukumar Chandra Rai, Dr. Sadiq Ali, and Srimati Shampa Shah for their Shampa Rai for their cooperation. On behalf
all the
of
participants.
On behalf of the Department of Philosophy, I convey my regards and thanks to all the learned participants for their patience, for their fellow feeling and interaction. It's a very nice interaction section we realize here. Thanks to all our students, they are silently listening Professor Purushottama sir's lectures, and they failed to give a loud clap due to the COVID-19. We are guided by Google Meet. That's why they are not giving a very loud clap. I also thank research scholars for their participation through Google Meet. And due to Google Meet, you are staying at Melbourne, we are staying at Malda. Due to Google Meet, this event is possible.
Yeah.
So I am thanking you, the team members of Google Meet. So once again, thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, the learned participants. Thanks, my dear colleagues, student, research scholar, and our authorities of university. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. So, sarve bhavantu sukhina, sarve santu niramaya, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschit dukhabhat bhavet. Om shantihi, shantihi, shantihi.
So I'm not exactly in Melbourne. I'm about 2 hours outside a place called Venus Bay, which famously a lot of my friends and students know about. It's a country area.
It is written in your profile also, Facebook profile.
And it has windows which are called with Constantinian windows. You might. My libraries are about 2 big buildings.
Okay.
Behind here, but also I wanted to say there are a lot of my friends and some students, former students from Ashoka and Melbourne and friends are also watching. So I want to thank them and
we have recorded the lecture also, sir. We will release it in YouTube also later.
Well,
we will upload it.
But lots of people might be interested in listening.
Yes. And wish you good health, sir. That is most important.
We had a very good discussion. Thank you very much for your questions, and we had a wonderful discussion. It helped me clarify some of the more.
And take care, sir. Take care.
Namaskar, sir.
Shukriya Bhavato.
Namaskar, sir. Take care, sir. Take care, please, of your health. Thank you, Josnadi. Thank you, everyone. So we shall finish here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I'll have you turn it off. I'll wait till you turn it off. Bye bye.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Okay, bye, sir. Good night, sir.
Good night. Hope to see you all.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, sir.
Okay. Thank you. Namaskar.
Thank you, Kinaram Bhai. It's a very great pleasure. Kinaram Bhai is my brother. He is from my village. I just send a link throughout the day. He's watching throughout the program. He's watching our memorial lecture. So it's my native place. It's far away. It's a great pleasure to see you, Kinaram Bhai, my brother. Namaskar.
Thank you.
Thank you on behalf of the
ভালো থাকবেন I must go.
Yeah.
ভালো থাকবেন, স্যার। Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Josnadi, good night. সবাইকে ঝাড় শব্দ। এটা আপলোড করব, ইউটিউবে আপলোড হবে। স্ট্রিমিংটা থেমে গেছে, আপলোড হবে পরে।
যে ইন্টারনেট যে সমস্যা করেনি এটাই মানে খুব
না, ওই রেকর্ডিংটা হচ্ছে আপলোডটা, স্ট্রিমিংটা থেমে গেছিল ইন্টারনেটের জন্য আসলে।
আচ্ছা।
ওই জন্য আমি আবার মোবাইলে পরে কানেক্ট করলাম। সমস্যা হচ্ছে ওবিএস আর ইয়েটা একসাথে নিয়ে নিচ্ছে, ওবিএস আর গুগল মিটটা। তখন আর আমি শুনতে পাচ্ছি, কিন্তু আমার মাইক্রোফোনটা কাজ করছে না তখন। ওই জন্য পরে মোবাইলে আমি কানেক্ট করলাম।
করবি, থ্যাংক ইউ করবি। সোনালি অনেকে আছে।
হ্যাঁ দিদি, শুনলাম। থ্যাংক ইউ। ভালো লেগেছে। পুরোটা শুনেছি। সবাইকে ধন্যবাদ অনেক, সব স্যার ম্যাডামদের।
ভাস্বতী, থ্যাংক ইউ ভাস্বতী।
থ্যাংক ইউ জোৎস্নাদি।